So economists are debating the extent to which race plays a factor in the fact that black men in particular, and in general people of color, earn less than white men. How could this be? Let's talk about this in this video today. I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist and, as it turns out, also an academic economist. And I'm concerned about the direction this country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, and maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So the New York Times today had an article talking about how black workers stop making progress on pay. Is it racism? And apparently there's a debate among economists as to the extent to which this is racism. But this is really a narrow view of racism that's being debated. This idea that somehow race is just, we don't like black people, so we're not going to hire them. But that ignores the larger societal context in which that happens. And that's where a lot of these economists are kind of missing the point, actually. For example, in this article, some economists point to the fact that education is a key determinant as to wages in the United States now, that the higher your skills level, the more you tend to be paid. Well, certainly that is a big factor. But the question then becomes, why is there such a disparity in education between people who are white and people who are black? Because there is a huge disparity. And fundamentally, it has to do with the way that our educational system is set up and the way that we've sorted ourselves throughout this country. White people tend to sort themselves into white neighborhoods. Black people then kind of are forced to sort themselves into areas that are more considered black neighborhoods. And as black people traditionally have moved into neighborhoods that were dominated by whites, eventually a critical mass is reached, at which point white people tend to move out to another area which is more dominated by white people. Now, the impact that this has on education is the fact that the American education system is largely driven by local school districts and local property taxes. And as a result of that, you have a small area with potentially very good schools, with very high spending per student to make sure they get the best education possible. On the other hand, then, you'll have other areas that tend to be dominated perhaps by poorer people, by people of color, and for various reasons, those areas will not have the same educational attainment. It could be because of the fact that there isn't the same level of support from the government for those districts. It could be that the property values are lower, and so as a result, the income for the school district is lower. But the ultimate challenge is the fact that we have sorted ourselves into these specific areas, and the quality of the education is determined by which specific area you live in. So if white people tend to be in one area, they will make sure that the educational system available tends to be very good in that area. Whereas in another area where black people might be the dominant group, there will be less focus on making sure that the schools are at the same level. Now, that's an example of the institutional structure that has been developed in the United States that enforces racism. And whether we want to say that this specifically is racism that impacts the job market, ultimately, it is racism that impacts the job market. It may be through education that it impacts the job market, but it's still going to have an impact. Now, the response some people might say is, well, that's the way it's always been. What does it matter if we have local school districts? And local control is something that's actually beneficial to education. Now, I'm not going to debate that point with people because it's really irrelevant to this discussion. But what is relevant to this discussion is the fact that our system developed that way, at least in part because of the fact that it enforced these racial distinctions. It's like, for example, the reality that Social Security is not a benefit that is given to agricultural workers or railroad workers. Some might say, why is that the case? Well, back when the Social Security Administration Act was passed in the 1930s, those industries were dominated by people of color. So they wanted to deny Social Security to those groups. So what may seem on its face as something that is not based on race, ultimately it is. And it has a dramatic impact then upon the wealth that is available to white people versus black people. Let me give you another example, and this is on a slightly different topic, but it's the kind of example that I use with my students in class all the time. One question that comes up is, why is there this disparity in pay between men and women? And interestingly enough, what economists have been able to do is when they control for enough factors, when they basically say, if we control for the fact that women tend to take time off to take care of children, that women tend to go into different industries, when we control for those factors, then there really isn't much of a disparity between the pay of men and women. So obviously this isn't a problem. But that's kind of missing the point, isn't it? The fact is that society expects women to take time off to take care of their children. And then we impose a penalty in the workplace upon these women for the fact that they do take this time off to take care of children. Similarly, there's a sorting in terms of the career that women go into versus men. So traditionally, for example, doctors tended to be men, nurses tend to be women. Which is paid more? Doctors are paid more. So you might say, well, wait a minute, that's because of the educational differences. But how about teachers? Why are teachers paid so little? Well, again, this is a group which traditionally was dominated by women. So can we say that the disparities in pay between men and women is not based upon sexism? No, it's just that we've baked sexism into our system to ensure that there are different end results. And if we accept the system as it is, obviously, we're going to get the same result. But the fact is that the system is set up in a way that makes it so that women are paid less than men. Similarly, the system is set up so that pay is less for people of color than it is for white people. And this is despite the fact that on so many levels, it seems like racism is in decline throughout society. So just as women tend to sort themselves into certain professional groups, so do people of color. So, for example, in the jobs that include personal care aides and security guards and couriers and messengers, jobs that were specifically mentioned in this article, those jobs tend to be overrepresented for people of color. So the question you have to ask yourself, do people of color go into these jobs because of the fact that these are lower paid? Or are these jobs lower paid because of the fact that there tends to be a lot of people of color who work there? And to some extent, there's probably a combination of the two. Now, let me use one more example, and this is again an example from sexism, but it's equally applicable in the context of racism, and it has to do with medical doctors. Because I can already hear the claims from people, oh, well, these professions require less abstract skills than certain professions that are dominated more by white people. But again, let's take a look at medical doctors. Now, the fields that tend to be dominated by women, which include, for example, pediatrics, tend to be among the lowest paid. And yet other specialties, many of which require no more education than to become a pediatrician, like say, for example, emergency medicine doctor, where men tend to dominate that field, those specialties are paid at a much higher rate than pediatrics, for example. Now, the response that people will give is they'll say, oh, that's the system. It's because of the way that payments are made. Payments are made based upon how many procedures the doctors do. But again, the question you have to ask yourself is, does it have to be that way? And the fact is, it doesn't have to be that way. That certainly we could envision a system in which pediatricians were paid as much as, say, emergency room physicians. But we didn't choose to adopt that system because of the fact that, again, women tend to dominate in fields like pediatrics and men tend to dominate in fields like emergency medicine. So these are examples, again, of where we've institutionalized these differences and made it so that even though it seems when you control for the factors that broader society has sexism and racism baked into it. And that's the point that's missed in this discussion among these economists. Now, one final point I want to make about this discussion is that this issue is what critical race theory looks at. The idea that racism is baked into society's institutions, that you might not be able to specifically say, oh, so-and-so is racist, but because of the fact that so-and-so is supporting the institutions the way they are, they're essentially supporting a racist system. And that's the discussion that right-wing conservatives are trying to stop when they attack critical race theory. Now, you might say that the argument over critical race theory and trying to ban it from the elementary schools is really just one of these culture war issues that Republicans engage in to try to get their base riled up and to try to kind of push a certain percentage of people over to their side. And that is certainly the case. But it's also missing the point that they are also trying to attack critical race theory where a serious discussion about it is actually going on, which is at the graduate and postgraduate level. Don't believe me? Well, consider the fact that in Florida, they just passed a law supported by the governor that is going to make it so that they can check on the ideology of college students and faculty members. Now, this law should scare anybody who's concerned about intellectual freedom. But more than that, what its intent is to make sure that we do not have a discussion of critical race theory and the impact that racism plays throughout the structures that we've set up in society. We can also see it with the efforts of the University of North Carolina to deny Nicole Hannah-Jones tenure. So it's important to note that critical race theory is not just a culture war issue that Republicans are trying to ride to electoral victory, but they're actually trying to silence the discussion at all because they don't want a discussion over how the structures we have throughout society are enforcing a racist and sexist system. Now, why are they doing that, you might ask? The reason being that the white men who are at the pinnacle of society want to maintain that position. And the extent to which we discuss changes that might be made in society that will make it so that everybody has better opportunity, that as we discuss those changes, that's the type of thing that will ultimately threaten white men being able to be at the top of that pyramid. So if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to hear your comments below. In the meantime, if you could like this video, subscribe to this channel, I'll see you in the next video, and let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.